Hello, everyone. My name is Olka Joshi-Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer at Grantmakers for Education. And on behalf of Celine Coggins, our Executive Director, and other members of our team, just want to say thank you for joining us later-ish in the day on late July in the middle of summer. So thank you for making time for this. This is our Learning, Evaluation, and Data Impact Group meeting. Our impact groups are places for funders that have common interests to come together and learn together. So really appreciate Nicole Eiffel from Gates Foundation and Dr. Eric Tishalis from KnowledgeWorks, who are our co-chairs for planning and organizing today's session. So thanks for joining, and Nicole, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thanks, Olka. And it's wonderful to see both familiar faces and new ones. As Olka mentioned, I'm Nicole Eiffel. I'm Deputy Director over at the Gates Foundation and will be facilitating today's session. I just want to give you a little bit of info about how we're going to structure the conversation and then introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Matt Soldner. So first off, Olka mentioned that Eric and I are the co-chairs of the Learning, Evaluation, and Data Impact Group. We do have a nice website or webpage on the EdFunders website, and invite you to share that with others in our community that are interested in data, in evaluation, in answering and exploring the way that we craft and understand evidence in the field. And we meet quarterly and really have a mission towards continuous improvement, ensuring that all of us are learning more about how to ensure that the investments that our philanthropic organizations make have the impact that we expect. And so many of you have been members of that community. And today we have invited Dr. Matt Soldner, who is currently Commissioner of the National Center for Education Evaluation since 2018, as well as recently named, though not so recently, probably about a year or two ago, Chief Evaluation Officer for the Institute of Education Sciences. Before Matt gets started, those are all his titles, but I'll just mention that I've known Matt maybe a decade now. I'm a little scared that that's got to be double digits. Matt has not strayed too far from where he and I first connected. He used to work at National Center for Education Statistics, which is a group within IES focused on the sample surveys, including post-secondary outcomes for beginning college students. So just wanted to make that personal connection. Matt's got a long tenure of working with within the federal education system and ensuring that we all are benefiting from those wonderful investments. And he did take a little bit of a break to go and work for a nonprofit, AIR, in between, and so bring some of that external research think tank expertise to the work as well. So we are going to do about 30 minutes of presentation from Matt. We will pause at various points for folks to ask questions, ideally through the chat function for that first part. Then we'll, at the end of the 30 minutes, Matt will remove his presentation and we'll have about 15 minutes open Q&A, which I will facilitate and moderate. And then with any time remaining, especially those of you who have been members of our Lead Impact Group, you're welcome to stay for some business updates on one of our signature investments, which is the SRE Fellowship Program that we sponsor with the Society for Research and Educational Effectiveness. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to share his screen and give us a little bit more about today's presentation. And I'm really excited about the learning agenda, and I hope you all are as well.
All right, thanks, Nicole. And hopefully you guys are starting to see a screen right now. All right, excellent. So yeah, thanks, Nicole. It is wonderful both to see you. You're right, it's been a while we've been connected, and to be in front of this group. It is great to be among friends and talking about a topic that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts, which is answering questions that we need to have answered to make sure that all learners are achieving to their fullest potential. I am lucky to be able to come back to you guys actually a second time. This is a return engagement for me. But last we spoke, we had a somewhat different set of topics we addressed. So when last we were together, I gave you a quick overview of the Department of Education and kind of where the Institute of Education Sciences fits within it, in case you're not familiar with us. We talked a bit about what I mean, what the department means when we talk about evidence, and then transitioned into a conversation about how we can engage with philanthropy around evidence building and evidence use. But unfortunately, at that time, I could not share with you the department's learning agenda. I could only tease it. It hadn't been yet released. And as you probably, or as you may have heard, this learning agenda is the list of topics and the prior learning questions that here at the department, we most want to answer in the coming 4 years to meet its mission. But that wait to share with you the full learning agenda is finally over. I'm really glad to say in July of 2022, we were able to publish the department's strategic plan, and as part of that is learning agenda. If you have not gone to evaluation.gov, there's a screen clip on this slide right here. You can find both the department's learning agenda as well as the learning agenda for all the other federal agencies that have made them available. So don't do it now. I'm going to give you a preview of our learning agenda right now, but when you have some time later on in your day or in the coming weeks, feel free to go to evaluation.gov, review our learning agenda as well as learning agenda for other departments that you might have some interest in. So here's going to be the roadmap for our time today. I will give a bit of a background again on the department and IES, just in case you're not familiar with us. I'll introduce the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. That's the federal law that caused the department and other federal agencies to develop learning agendas and make them public. Then I will share the actual learning agenda for the department and ask you all to help me think about opportunities where you might choose to engage. We'll then transition into a discussion around some specific thoughts I've had around philanthropy engaging with us. And then, as promised, we'll turn it over for the last 15 minutes of my time with you all to do some discussion, Q&A, and any final thoughts. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, but I will depend upon Nicole or others to feel free to stop and interrupt me if there's something in there that seems really pressing or really on point to address in a moment. So if that sounds good, let me give you just a bit of an overview of IES. I don't want to assume that you all are deeply familiar with our work. Hopefully, you have a sense of the large U.S. Department of Education and that we're situated within it. Here's a quick diagram if you ever wanted an org chart of the U.S. Department of Education. Now you have it. IES, the box right in the center of your screen, or at least the center of that diagram, was created in 2002 as part of the Education Sciences Reform Act. And we're one of 8 parts of the department out of the 20 or so components that reports directly to the secretary. And our authorizing legislation gives my colleagues and I here at IES a really unique mission, both inside the department and I think unique among federal agencies in general. IES's mission, at least according to our statute, is, as you can see here, to provide national leadership in expanding fundamental knowledge and understanding of education across a wide range of kind of grade band and age ranges for a wide range of constituents, ranging from parents to policymakers and everyone in between. And there are some specific components the law calls out for IES to focus on, including the condition and progress of education, specific practices that improve student learning and academic achievement, and evaluating the effectiveness of federal education programs. So in a slide, that's our remit. What's the state of the world and what works, both in terms of classroom practice from K to college, and then our federal education programs working to achieve the mission that Congress has established for them. What's really unique, I think, about IES, and maybe even more important than the statutory remit that we have, is that IES was specifically set out to be independent from the main department, and in carrying out our mission, trying to abide by the principles set forth here of the highest qualities of highest standards of quality, integrity, and accuracy, and completely objective, secular, neutral, and non-ideological. So although we are part of a government agency and we are headed by a political appointee, we are completely independent from the department in terms of the work we choose to pursue and how we choose to characterize what we've learned. So you can hopefully come to us with the notion that the things we do are neutral, objective, and kind of the straight up facts we believe them to be. That is a really quick nickel tour of IES. Before I jump into some things you might recognize us from, are there any questions I can answer about IES or our place inside the department? And I'll just look at the chat for 1 second. If something comes to you, feel free to add it. I'll keep the chat open. But in the meantime, let me go ahead and give you a sense of the kind of work we do in case you're still not sure, like, do I know these people? If you're familiar with NAEP, the Nation's Report Card, the every 4-year survey of what students know in math and science and reading and many other subjects in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, that's us. That's our National Center for Education Statistics. If you've ever heard of College Navigator, if you've had a college-age student or someone who you're trying to advise about identifying the college is right for them, College Navigator, that's us. If you've heard about the What Works Clearinghouse, resources for classroom educators about practices that have been shown to move the needle on student achievement, we do that. You may have heard of our regional education labs, 10 R&D centers spread across the country, each working with state and local education agencies to answer questions of policy and practice. That's us as well. And in addition to those things, you may know us from high-profile federal evaluations of education programs, like the screenshot I have here of our SIG grant evaluation, or for funding individual researchers doing one of any number of professional journal articles you see there on the screen. So if you weren't familiar with us, that's a bit of our highlight reel. If you want to visit our website, I'd encourage you to do so, ies.ed.gov. And I do see your question, Bethany. I'll get to it in just 1 second before I transition. So in addition to all of those things we do, in addition to College Navigator and all the like, we also have the pleasure of often being asked by department leadership to take on anything that is kind of technical or scientific in nature as it relates to the education sciences. And so that is why I'm here today. I'm actually wearing my hat as a delegate for the secretary, not as commissioner of NCE. I serve as our agency's chief evaluation officer. And that's why I'm joining you all today to talk about our learning agenda. Bethany has a question, which maybe we'll pick up in the Q&A at the end, about how we decide what programs to evaluate. That's excellent, and I think it will fit nicely into our discussion at the end if we can hold it, Bethany. So I'm here today to talk specifically about a line of work inside the department that IES is responsible for that was motivated by the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. And if you are not a devotee of federal evidence policy, that's completely all right. The kind of thumbnail sketch is as follows. The Evidence Act grew out of a bipartisan committee, was chaired by Paul Ryan and Patty Murray. And among the many things that commission recommended was that agencies really double down on the use of evidence to improve policymaking. And if that evidence was somehow lacking, that they take the steps needed to build it. And so subsequent guidance from OMB then kind of went on to tell us what it was that Congress meant, both by what evidence is and how it is we should go about the process of building and using it for policymaking. So just to level set, when we talk about evidence in the context of the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, that law is asking departments to build evidence in kind of 4 broad categories, not all of which might spring immediately to mind to you when you hear the word evidence. So it includes these 4 lines of work. OMB charges departments to engage in what they call foundational fact-finding, which really gets to what are conditions on the ground inside the area of responsibility for a government agency. It has to do with performance measurement. Government agencies have tons of federal programs, that's the technical word for it. Are we effectively using performance tools to monitor and then improve our progress towards goals that those programs are authorized to achieve? It includes, as part of evidence, the notion of policy analysis. So rigorous analytics that we do to try to understand what might be happening because of a policy action or what might happen if we were to go down a certain policy pathway. And then finally, evidence includes program evaluation, which really gets to those very specific causal questions. Did this policy, did this program cause a change in outcomes for students for the education landscape? And all of these are types of evidence that the Evidence Act calls us to build. So in addition to doing that, the Evidence Act says agencies have to be transparent about what it is they want to learn more about and why they want to learn it. And the mechanism that Congress and OMB envisioned for us to use, both to document those learning goals and make them available to the public, is a learning agenda. So every 4 years, agencies develop learning agendas that include researchable questions that, if we answered them, would allow us to better meet our mission. And then annually, we have to talk about our progress towards those through our work in significant evaluations. So every 4 years, you'll see every agency publish a learning agenda, and every year you'll see agencies publish an evaluation plan. Before I move on from this kind of Evidence Act framing and show you what's in the department's learning agenda, any questions about the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act?
I did have a question, Matt, which
Sure,
is,
Nicole.
I know also that there's actually an expansive amount of other things in the Evidence Act. And in addition to the Chief Evaluation Officer and the learning agenda, there's also a requirement that all agencies have a Chief Data Officer. I'm just curious whether, aside from being in the same legislation, whether there's any formal coordination or requirements around those two new positions coming together in service of the measurement and evaluation you need to do related to the learning in the first place. Yeah.
No, that's great. And so there's actually 3 statutory positions that the Evidence Act creates. So it creates the Chief Evaluation Officer, that's me, creates the Chief Data Officer, that in our department is Greg Fortelny, and it creates a statistical official. And in the Department of Education, that's Peggy Carr, who is also the commissioner for NCES. And the theory of action, for lack of a better word, behind the Evidence Act is that I work with policy leadership to identify the questions that need to be answered. I then go to Greg, our Chief Data Officer, and say, hey, Greg, I need data to answer these questions. Can you help me secure it? Either by data collections inside our department or by connecting with other federal agencies or state agencies to get the data. And then Peggy, as statistical official, is charged with ensuring that we maintain both the highest standard of security and confidentiality for those data so that there's no risk of personally identifiable information being shared, and that we're analyzing it in a statistically responsible manner. So those 3 roles work together to execute against the learning agenda, in addition to many other things they have to do on their own. So we coordinate regularly and have actually, probably not surprising, several standing meetings where we kind of keep ourselves pointed in the same direction. But it's a whole infrastructure beyond just my part of the act. I'm just sort of the kickoff point for the work the others then take on. Great question.
Super helpful.
Absolutely. And Chris, I'll actually take your question in just a second here as I go through. So with all that lead up, let me show you what actually is in the learning agenda. So the suspense can be eliminated in case you're sitting there with bated breath. So the department's learning agenda has 6 focus areas, and they are all aligned to priorities the secretary has been talking about over the past year and a half. So you'll see the first priority focuses squarely on addressing the impact of COVID-19. Our second focus area is around the promotion of equity. Our third focus area is around diverse and talented educator workforces. Number 4, meeting students' social, emotional, and academic needs in the K-12 space, and parenthetically. In pillar 5, increasing post-secondary value by focusing on both affordability, completion, and post-enrollment success. And then finally, specifically managing federal student aid programs. And so if you've heard the Secretary talk about his goals for the department, you've heard about all of these topics: supporting students through pandemic recovery, boldly addressing gaps and opportunity in achievement, making sure higher ed is inclusive and that pathways lead to successful careers. And so all those themes are woven through these various pillars. I'm now going to do a double click into each of those so you can see the specific questions we are most interested in answering. As I do that, a few questions you can have in the back of your mind that I think would be helpful for our discussion later on. First off, do you see alignment between the questions I have and the questions you have? Maybe, and this would be wonderful, some of you already have answers to these questions you can share with us. 3, maybe if you don't yet have answers, might you be considering funding work that could answer a mutually interesting question? And then finally, are there blind spots? Are there things we are missing that we should be aware of? And Olga, I see your question. I'll loop back to that in just a bit. So let's do this double click right now. Inside each of the pillars, there are some very specific researchable questions. I'm not going to read these to you. You guys can see the screen, but briefly, you can kind of get a sense of, as it relates to COVID-19, we're interested in some simple kind of descriptive information about what's happening with student achievement and students' opportunities to learn. We're interested in how federal funds are being used, you probably are too, to support recovery efforts. And then in the final questions, we're interested in surfacing and spreading effective practices in 3 very specific areas: social emotional well-being, academic support, particularly in core academic areas, and then what are things we can do to be supporting the well-being of educators, faculty, and instructional leaders. So this COVID-19 pillar is elevated up as a kind of its own topic, even though you will see that these resonate throughout some of the other components of our learning agenda. Perhaps no surprise at all, we have a specific focus on promoting equity. So again, we begin with something really descriptive. To what extent are students and other beneficiaries being able to avail themselves of our services, and is there equity in their access, participation, and outcomes department programs? But then once we've had a sense of kind of that lay of the land, what are the actual policies, programs, and services we can adopt to move the needle, whether that's around academic achievement, whether that's around college and career readiness, and whether it's about creating supportive learning environments. So again, 3 questions related both to landscaping and then kind of what educators and policymakers can do around the promotion of equity. The educator workforce, a topic the Secretary has spoken about many times, and I think probably all of us acknowledge is an area where we need to have increased attention. So what can we do around making sure we are as being effective as we possibly can in preparing, recruiting, and retaining a well-qualified educator workforce, especially in areas that are hard to staff, in fields that are hard to staff, and how can we be sure that those educators are as prepared as possible to go into classrooms to provide support to students and families in this recovery period when we know that additional support is sorely needed. And then finally, what can we do to diversify the educator workforce? What can we do to make sure that when students are in a classroom, they see someone who looks like them in the front of the room, or at least at some point during the course of their school day? In the 4th pillar, we focus a bit more deeply in some specific topics in the K-12 space around both social, emotional, and academic needs. And so you'll see each question here kind of gets to a specific strand of work or interest area for us. So for example, in the first question, we're looking specifically at SEL. And the second question, we're really interested in secondary CTE programs and how those can help ensure that folks have access to high quality and inclusive pathways. We want to know what we can do around the creation of learning environments that really allow every student to achieve to their full potential and is free of bias. And then we have in the 4th question, a specific emphasis on multilingual learners, including native language acquisition. I know some of you are post-secondary folk, and so don't worry, you have not been left out in the learning agenda. There are 2 pillars that really focus specifically on post-secondary education. And as you look at the questions we have in these spaces, You'll see questions that I hope seem relevant and familiar to you. So how can we be sure we have equitable access and readiness for post-secondary education, especially through college access programs? How can we support adult learners in their pathways? How can we have what we call seamless and cost-effective transitions between various levels and types of education and training? And then in questions 4 and 5, we focus on two different parts of the kind of Higher Education Act infrastructure. Programs and services are especially designed to support individual students. So you might think of things in that space like TRIO programs. And then the fifth question, what are things we can do to support those institutions who serve students, especially MSIs, tribal colleges, or HBCUs, so Title V higher education programs. And then last but not least, a topic that's probably near and dear to everyone on this call, whether you are a parent of a borrower or a one-time borrower yourself, federal student aid. And here we have a series of questions about the borrower experience and how we can improve that, how we can have a better understanding of how students can more effectively repay their student loans so they don't have an adverse outcome. And then are the things we can do to make the federal student aid programs writ large kind of more effectively targeted to be sure that all students who we want to benefit are having full access to federal financial aid programs. So that is a very quick tour of the topics. Chris had asked whether there are cross-agency questions, and the answer is not necessarily in agendas, Chris, but when we have shared work in a space, we do huddle up. That's part of the joy of having these things be shared publicly. And so you probably saw in an earlier slide an emphasis in adult learners. So part of the work we're doing is about career navigators in adult education. And our buddies in the Department of Labor are focusing on career navigation around veterans and career navigation in, I believe, in incarcerated learners. And so we're all trying to figure out from slightly different angles based upon the programs we have kind of inside our portfolio, how can we learn together? And so yes, there is intentional knitting together of cross-agency questions. And certainly there are things around COVID recovery and use of funds that unite all the agencies who had programs authorized through CARES and the subsequent act. So that's a great question.
Yes, we've got questions rolling in, Matt, so
yeah.
I can help you out here.
Thank you.
So you don't have to scroll too much here. Olka also had a question that I was trying to parse while reading, but I wonder, Olka, if you actually want to come off mute and voice over your question. We've got a small group here today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Matt. This was great. You know, we're hearing a lot of people talking about ecosystems of learning and the ways in which schools and districts need to participate with kind of non-formal actors, whether it's youth development and other things. And the language in some of these slides still feels very like school and district heavy. And so I'm curious the ways in which the administration is kind of expanding that, and research is kind of very intentionally taking a look at kind of the broader context in which we could potentially help and support students.
Yeah, so Olga, that's a great question. And if you were to double click one level below these questions and see the projects that are supporting answering them, I think you would see a number of them, particularly in the K-12 space, I would say perhaps more than in the post-secondary space, although not specifically, do have that focus. So examples, evaluations of full service and community schools, right, which is necessarily a whole school and CBO kind of approach. Evaluations of promised neighborhoods, right, which is not necessarily school-based at all, right? That could be based out of a hospital system, for example, trying to improve health and other outcomes inside a community. Our evaluation of transition supports for students with disabilities that we're thinking about how do we develop navigators that connect students who are served by IDEA or the Rehabilitation Act. How do we develop transition plans that connect them to school or to work, but then draw in community resources? So those topics aren't necessarily robustly reflected in the questions, but as you look at the work of the department, what we're studying and how we're designing our programs, I think you'll see us drawing those community actors into the space. Perhaps as we think about revising the learning agenda, we should give a bit more of a nod to that, because if it's not clear, well, it's not clear on the surface, obviously, from asking your question, but the work does reflect that spirit, so we could do a better job of signaling, I think, of some of the questions.
Thank you.
Yep.
Jacqueline had a few questions too. The first one was related to the promoting equity slide. She was wondering about a reference in the first question related to education programs and services supported by the department, and was curious for some examples about which programs and services may fall under that purview.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jacqueline. And so, Jacqueline, the question is phrased that way because we don't want to limit, either in the eyes of my colleagues here in the department or in the public, our interest in any one particular program. We want to charge every program inside the department to be collecting data and looking at that data to be able to ask questions about who that program is serving and whether that is, whether there's equitable access. If there's equitable access, is there equitable participation? As there's equitable participation, is there equity in the outcomes? So we are literally thinking with every program about how the data they are collecting allows them to do that kind of work, and are trying to work with offices to find kind of models inside their portfolios where we can say, hey, look at how this particular program did this equity analysis. How can the rest of you inside this portfolio do the same? So it's intentionally, maybe it reads as intentionally vague. We wrote it to be intentionally broad, to say we're not just focusing in one space. Everyone in education should be asking that question about each of the federal programs we observe and oversee.
That's super helpful, Matt. Thank you. And I'll just say for transparency that I actually read it completely the opposite, and it flashed quickly. So I initially read it as intentionally being very narrow, and that there was like a list that you all were sort of thinking about. So that clarification is super helpful. Thank you.
That question's helpful because it probably suggests we need to have some more framing around that question. I appreciate it. And should I pick up your other question while we're here? All right, so I knew someone was going to say this. So there's a blind spot that I knew walking into this that I didn't telegraph, but and it's early childhood, right? So why is that? So the federal early childhood landscape largely resides with my colleagues down the way at HHS, with the exception of serving some preschool age youth who have a risk of having disabilities through IDEA Part C. So that is a place where I think the department and HHS have a real opportunity to collaborate. So like ACF would be like a natural partner for us, right, in the early childhood space. But I'll be completely honest in saying we have not made those connections yet. Not for any good reason, honestly, but not because of some bad reason, like we don't want to collaborate, like we just simply haven't gotten there yet. So you're totally right. I figured somebody would say something, and we are aware we need to be moving in that direction.
That actually relates to a question that I had, ties Chris's question from earlier about cross-agency coordination, and then Jacqueline's question here about early childhood. Earlier you mentioned a few places where, in particular, Department of Labor has the opportunity to partner with Department of Ed. It sounds like HHS, it's much more nascent. I'm wondering if you could just highlight a few other agencies that may not come to mind initially that you all that this work has actually generated a partnership around, and then we can transition to some of the other questions in the chat.
Sure. So in full transparency, our labor connection is by far the strongest. We have some other connections of folks who have data that we need to use to understand long-term outcomes, but they are more of a data provider than a thought partner in the work. But I think there are other ACFs out there that we should be talking to, right? So we know the Department of Agriculture, for example, has school food programs. How are we talking to the Department of Ag? We know that SAMHSA inside HHS is specifically charged with working to develop sort of a national strategy on trauma-informed care. How are we partnering with SAMHSA on that effort? So these are all things where we have, I'd say, budding connections, but we don't yet have a tight connection with the other agencies. But these learning agendas create the opportunity for offices to sit down and kind of read one another's work and see where we might plug in. There's also a bit of an infrastructure now inside the Office of Management and Budget that's intentionally looking for potential synergies. since this is really just the first month, no agencies have their learning agenda up for more than 5 months at this stage. I think we're still in the early days, but I think you will be seeing more of that collaboration and greater synergies as time moves forward.
That's helpful. Bethany had a question around how you all arrive. Oh, goodness. Apparently my office doesn't think I'm in here anymore.
Oh. I see the lights went out in your, yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. Alas. Asking how the process by which you arrived at these questions, and to what extent did that process engage researchers, practitioners, or even learners? So Matt, if you could talk about maybe some of the previous process, and I know you were going to showcase a few future activities as well, and this may be a good time for that. And in fact,
Sure.
I wonder if we can just pull down the slides, because it seems like folks are ready to dive in, and if we want to pivot back to the last slide on just philanthropic role, we can always put that back up as people's questions slow down.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me move you guys into my main window, so I'm actually looking straight into the cameras. Too many monitors. So we developed this first draft of the learning agenda. We kind of do still think of it as a draft through a combination of Federal Register notices and RFIs, right? So we did a request for information last year, which brought in hundreds of pages of public comment on topics we should be focused on. I'll admit earlier childhood was in there, and we made the choice, per Russ's question, not to include it because we didn't feel like, given the kind of slice of the programmatic pie that we owned in that space, we could lean into that as much as we lean into other areas. So we acknowledged it was something that was important. So there was the RFI process, there was engagement with policy leadership inside the department and across the government. In some topical areas, there were what we would kind of call a technical working group, where we brought together researchers, experts, and advocates in certain spaces. But it was not as complete as we necessarily would have liked to take on. So now that we actually have this document and it is public, we're going to be able to do more significant outreach. So what I would like to do, and you guys will hopefully be seeing if you subscribe to our news flash or follow us on Twitter, kind of topic area by topic area listening sessions, where we'll be able to invite folks to join us and really dig into those questions and get the kind of feedback like we're getting today, both on what looks good, what might the blind spots be, and really importantly, what work is happening out there that we can help leverage. One thing that the Evidence Act is pretty clear on is that departments' questions are going to exceed their capacity to answer them. And we really will have to depend on other people inside our ecosystem to help us answer questions that we cannot get to. And so I'm not going to pull up a slide that says this, but the kind of gist of it is, if you see synergies between the work that we have questions about and the work that you want to fund, we would love to be in conversation. I don't want to be coming back to you 4 years from now and saying, well, we didn't have the resources or the staff time or whatever to get these questions answered. And then have you say back to me, well, we've known that answer all along. Why didn't you come to us? So this is my plea for engagement. If there's something in those questions, and Nicole, you can certainly feel free to share the deck after our time together, please reach out to me, whether that's individually, whether that's joining one of the learning sessions we'll announce in the coming weeks. However you feel comfortable doing, we want to be in conversation with you all around answering these important questions. All right, I see lots of other questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to call on Chris. I think he was next with a meaty question here around outcomes of specific programs. You want to come off mute and voice over your question for Matt?
Sure. Thanks, Nicole. Hey, Matt. Good to see you.
Hey, man.
Nothing else. So, just a question. We were trying to be really thoughtful when we engage with like tribal colleges and universities and understand their capacity limitations. At the same time, I know sometimes like Title III-A or Title V programs, those institutions will say like, we need resources and this is our purpose of why we want the resources as like a condition of receiving additional funding. What I haven't been able to find is like a write-up of like, did those fundings actually allow those institutions to accomplish those outcomes or not? Because that would inform how we show up and engage and which institutions we choose to work with. Because our biggest challenge for us as we've worked to work with minoritized institutions who are underfunded is making sure that we are showing up in ways that'll be helpful for them. And so any insights or guidance you could provide about like what you're learning and those programs in particular, giving it back would be helpful.
Sure. So this is a deep cut on why some information is more available in some areas than others. So until fiscal year 2022, there was no money set aside by Congress to do research or evaluation on most programs authorized by the Higher Education Act, including programs related to any strengthening institution type program. This year, for the very first time ever, Congress added a little sentence which said we can set aside 0.5% of monies authorized under HEA to conduct research and evaluation on HEA authorized programs, which will produce resources that allow the Office of Postsecondary Education to answer questions they have been asking for forever, but never had the capacity to get to. So that's huge. There's been since 2015 an analogous set aside in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so this is great news. I think the other thing that I will say, even though this is being recorded, and so you can quote me on this, Title II of the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act is called the Open Data Government Act, which challenges agencies to make all their data public unless there's a statutory prohibition against doing so. And so if you really had detailed questions about the outcomes arising from any program inside the department, there will be a process by which the public can say, hey, I really want to know, like, what data do you have on this? And unless it is just completely infeasible for the department to pull that together for you, we are exhorted by the Evidence Act to do that. And so there's a lot to figure out about how agencies are going to do that. There are no resources associated with the Evidence Act, financial or staff. You guys know how that goes, right? But Title II of the Act really does say if it can be made public, it should be made public. And so if you were to say, for example, look at the form grantees have to return to the department as part of their Strengthening Institutional Programs grant, and you saw there was a data element on there that you wanted to analyze, you could imagine requesting of the department, hey, where are those data? The Evidence Act says that should be made public. I'm not going to tell you to do that, but I suggest to you that it's something that someone might do if they want that information. In fairness, right now, asking that would be really burdensome to the no resources point, but that kind of transparency, that kind of engaging the whole world in the research enterprise about our priority learning questions, that's what the Evidence Act is about in some ways, right? Yeah, OP will now hate me and no longer take my calls, but you know, occupational hazard.
Thank you, my friend.
Yep.
Eric, I see you had a question here also for Matt. Do you want to come off mute and get his reaction?
Yeah, the background on this is just we worked with 5 different states to try to access really, really cool data that's looking at post-secondary and linking it to school level changes and all of that. And what we just found, no surprise to you and most others on this call, is it's the wild, wild west with state longitudinal data systems. There's no possibility of merging, matching, and masking those data to protect anonymity because they're designed and carried out and so differently, even though some of those longitudinal data systems exist because of and as a response to federal mandates and federal funding. So what levers are you pulling? What's happening in the DOE to try to establish some intercomparability of those SLDS across the United States so that we can do some more comparisons that's not always within states, but around and across? Just wondering if you have any comments about that, if you can't point to something specific.
What can I say? Yes, I feel your pain. That is a thing. The department has invested, the taxpayers have invested a massive amount in state longitudinal data systems. They've gotten lots of local returns, right? Like serving the needs inside a state or a LEA. Matching those data remain hard. 9 times out of 10, non-governmental solutions have popped up to facilitate matching and linking, right, that we had nothing to do with. So Midwest Collaboratives, work that Julia Lane and others have done as part of the Coleridge Initiative. There are surely others, right? The State Longitudinal Data Systems program at the department is run by 2 human beings, I think, who are doing their best to attempt to make sure that states have the resources they need. They pull those folks together regularly in communities of practice to try to talk about issues of comparability and standardization. But I think there's a huge conversation to be had, Eric, about metadata standardization across the entire architecture. It's really a dorky topic, which I'm not sure all the folks on the call care about, but it's hugely important, right? Like all these systems need to be talking about things in ways, if not identical, that are at least interoperable. And we haven't gotten there as a country yet. So there's some voluntary initiatives, right? Like SEDS in the K-12 space, like PESC in the post-secondary space. I am not allowed to lobby anybody for anything. I will say, you know, resources are always a constraint. And so if you think SLDSs are not where they need to be, advocating for making sure that states and districts continue to receive resources to strengthen them is important. It is disturbing to me that 2 years into the pandemic, we have lots of LEAs who, because through no fault of their own, beyond not having kind of robust data systems, for example, can't keep track of what students are getting high impact tutoring. And therefore I can't make any causal statements about what the heck we're getting for the investment in high impact tutoring, right? And we've been on about that topic now, as I said, for 2 years. It's tough. But if anyone on this call has if this is a passion project for anyone on this call and they want to advocate for more SLDS funding, I'm sure folks at states and local education agencies would appreciate it. And we would send you all our best wishes.
Yes, well, I know there are definitely some funders thinking and trying to address that work, and happy to take that as an impact group topic if folks are interested in digging in. I also found Bethany's reflection on some support work that she's doing with the Institute for Higher Education Policy to be really interesting, and maybe we can dig into there in another meeting. I see we're getting close to the end of our time here with Matt, and so just I know there was an early question from Bethany about how IES decides to evaluate particular federal programs, and so not sure if that's merely just where you have funding, but Matt, if there's a process there you want to share. And then I think if you want to put your slides back up just as the call to action of what you hope, especially as you talk about advocacy for SLDS system support, what else can philanthropy do to support the success of the learning agenda and actually answering these questions? I think that would be great.
Sure. All right. I will put up just the non-slide view just to make it easy so I don't lose you guys. I have no notes that are secret that y'all can't see. So I put my email address in the chat, but feel free, it's also here on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me. That's the best way to get in touch with me if this triggered something for you. 3 quick hits on things you might think about doing to kind of integrate your research and evidence building work into ours. 1, if you can support rigorous research, we would strongly encourage you to do that, especially if you're granting in the K-12 space. As you guys probably know, the Every Student Succeed Act really pushes states and districts towards the use of practices that are supported by strong or moderate evidence. That basically means research that's at the kind of randomized controlled trial or quasi-experiment level. That's not where all grantees can be, not where all funders want to be, but if you can generate that kind of evidence, that's really helpful. An issue that's really near and dear to our hearts right now that we have not figured out how to execute against is this notion of building local evaluator capacity. We have questions about the extent to which, particularly in our competitive grant program, we're not hearing from some communities about their local innovations because we require them to have an evaluation partner, but there isn't someone in their community that they can access who can meet kind of our evidence standards. So we're really wondering, how can we invest in CBOs and local evaluators to build capacity outside of firms like I used to work for, because not everyone needs to, have that type of firm at their side. So if you're investing in communities, think about also investing in their evaluators. And then finally, if you were not ready to go down the rigorous evaluation path, that's cool. At a minimum, please think about the value of logic models. Logic models are the gateway drug, right, to evaluation. That's what gets us to better measurement and developing even correlational answers to important questions. If you don't require logic models for programs, I would encourage it. If you need a tool, we have a million of them. I have a link to one here. I think Nicole will share these resources and you can access it once she does. Again, my email address, please reach out. Bethany, I don't want to leave your question hanging. It is not just about, we don't choose how to evaluate just on the basis of resources, but resources are really important. We have limited staff capacity and limited evaluation dollars. And so it's a balance of, is it congressionally mandated? Is there a pending policy decision, either in Congress or the department, that needs to be answered? And we therefore need to ask the question. And then do we then have staff and financial resources to do the work? And so oftentimes that means there's things we really wish we were evaluating that we aren't. But that's where we hope philanthropy can come in. And if you see a spot for yourself, do not hesitate to raise your hand. I will be more than glad to talk with you all. All right, Nicole, have I totally exceeded my time provided?
Well, I think it was a rich conversation, folks. I hope got your questions answered, or at least you've at least been introduced to a person in the department that can help answer them along the way. I can see from Matt dropping his email address into the chat and twice in his PowerPoint that he is interested in our feedback. He may regret that later, but for now, I think we should all take that as an opportunity to think about what is valuable there. We are going to say goodbye to Matt and appreciate his time. And for those who may have additional time available, we wanted to have a funder-only conversation and share, as I said earlier, some lead updates, but didn't want to slow down what was some really interesting questions for the department as they embark on that first learning agenda. So I'm excited.
Hey, thanks again, you guys. It was really a privilege to be able to speak with you guys today, and a pleasure. And do take me up on my offer. With that, I will leave you to your own internal business. Have a great day. Great to see you all.
Snaps to
All
Matt.
right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Well, great. Well, it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and some new ones. Welcome to those of you who this may be your first time coming to a Lead Impact Group meeting. I think it was just great to have that information from Matt. We will definitely share the slide deck, and just wanted any quick reflections, especially while it's top of mind. If there's anything that you all would love for the Lead Impact Group to dig deeper on, maybe there's a particular learning question that we could be organizing a session around, we'd love to take feedback in the moment to make sure we can take advantage of what we've learned today and incorporate it further into follow-up meetings.
Yeah, I would love to see the evaluation plans embedded within those learning questions, or the evidence, or just the plans in general to answer those learning questions would be really helpful.
Great. Yes, and I have a few links that I had, like, okay, when Matt says this, I'm going to drop it in the chat. I only succeeded on one of them, but I can make sure that we get those links to you so that you have access as well to some of the back matter that has evaluation plans as well. Any other topics that folks want to make sure come up, or takeaways from today that you were just surprised about, you didn't expect? Would love to hear any last thoughts before we wrap up.
Hi, Nicole, this is Bethany. I'm coming off mute just to say I'm highly appreciative of this SQL session with Matt. I just similar to the participant who just came off and wanted more information, I've got the document up and I'm looking forward to reading more how they're thinking about that 5th focus area that was focused on post-secondary ed. And while I don't know that this is a great topic for this group, since this group intentionally spans folks who do early childhood through post-secondary and beyond, but I would love, and any post-secondary funders on the call that are interested in having a focused conversation about what is in that focus area 5, the questions that they've presented, as well as some of the projects or the evaluation plans that they might be pursuing, and how we could be complementary to that. I would love to have that sequel conversation with a subset of you all. Most of you know how to reach me. I'll put my name, my email address in the chat box, but feel free to reach out if that also strikes you as something, a conversation you'd like to be part of.
One thing I'm really interested in is how the cross-sector partnerships can be deepened or expanded based on our role in philanthropy, but also tapping into that structure that they mentioned. I think that there is, to Matt's point, there's that gap on the early childhood side, and what can we do to actually maybe accelerate some of those partnerships between HHS or ACF within it with the department. So that's definitely something on my mind that I'd love to return to with those of you interested. And of course, there's the workforce piece, which is a whole animal of its own. Well, I know we're coming up on time, and I know that it is late, at least in my day. And so I think we're going to table some of the updates that we had on our broader programs. We can send a follow-up email to many of you. Primarily, we'll be asking about attendance at the upcoming Ed Funders Conference and exploring opportunities for us to engage in person after so much time in virtual land. So keep an eye out for that, which will come from either me or Eric, and we will be able to update. Any other thoughts, comments, questions you have, again, please send them to me or Eric or to the Ed Funders team. I don't know how everyone got to today's session, so we tried to expand our reach and awareness building. And for those of you whose names I don't recognize, again, I can drop my email address into the chat as one of the co-chairs. We'd love to have you more regularly at the impact group meetings and would love to engage with you more intentionally. So my email's in the chat, and I'll just say thank you all so much for your time and excitement, and appreciate all of the great questions for Matt.